What exactly is your own personal criteria for an all-time great? I don't think there's an answer out there that gets unanimous approval, but through this series, I want to help in outlining the argument for 7 different fighters as MMA's undisputed GOAT. Anderson Silva, Khabib Nurmagomedov, Amanda Nunes, George St-Pierre, Fedor Emelianenko, Demetrious Johnson, and John Jones. I won't try to deny it. These 7 fighters are not all on the same level, but each certainly has something that has established them as a cut above all others, within their respective divisions and eras. Everything else is a matter of preference. Week by week, I'll take one of these fighters, breaking down their unique claim to the throne, dropping some insight on where that claim might be hindered, before leaving the actual decision making up to you guys. I think it'll be an interesting and enjoyable dip into one of the sport's most ever-present topics. And between myself and you guys, our loyal viewers, we're gonna try and get as close as possible to finding MMA's GOAT. If you haven't already seen episode 1 of this series, which focused on Anderson Silva, I would urge you to check it out as soon as you're finished with this one. Because in that opening installment, and with an eye on the remainder of this GOAT series, the question that I know I'll repeatedly find myself stuck on will be the same one that entered my mind last week when I dealt with Silva, and the same one that has hounded my creation of this second episode. What exactly do we look at when we're searching for the one GOAT to rule all other GOATs? Is it a long, drawn-out stretch of form that saw a need for adaptation, evolution, where mistakes were made but challenges were overcome in spite of those mistakes, leaving us with our mouths agape as we watch the fighter in question just keep on winning and winning? Or do we look at the peaks these guys reached, how far they could push the limits of the sport, and from there, how long they could sustain that peak? Because as the old saying goes, you're only as good as your last fight, and well, maybe the question is, how good did it ever get? And again, for the purpose of this series, I'm going to do my best to indulge every angle that I can, because I do think that there are merits to all of them. And if we want to speak about the peaks that were reached inside the octagon, about the levels of domination that were achieved, I think this episode will serve as a strong indicator of this guy's excellence. Fight by fight, if MMA was purely a points-driven sport in the vein of football or basketball, Khabib Nurmagomedov would basically be winning by the most ridiculous of margins each and every time, by deficits that would make a 4-quarter game feel wrapped up by the conclusion of its opening stanza. Khabib might have hit the highest level of domination the sport of mixed martial arts has ever known, and I think there's an argument to be made for that stance. And even when you take the other fighters who seemed untouchable in their prime, no one can really say it more than Khabib. His fighting style, that relentless pressure-intensive forward movement on the feet, followed by watertight top control on the mat, the ground and pound, the submissions. It's a style that doesn't leave your opponent with much room to operate, literally. And though managing to pull off a dominant style of mixed martial arts is inherently more risky on the feet, every fight starts standing, and there's never been a fighter who has been able to impose their game plan, impose their will on their adversaries quite like Khabib. It might seem like an odd comparison to make, but the only way I can describe the last 7 or 8 fights of Nurmagomedov's career was to compare it to the prime days of Mike Tyson. Ask anyone who attended those fights in the 1980s. And the aura that Tyson carried changed the question from will Tyson win to what round will Tyson knock him out in. The end result was already pretty much clear. And Iron Mike's air of invincibility left the more trivial details up in the air. And in his own way, Khabib's time in the UFC was kind of similar. When that opening bell rang, it wasn't a question of if he would shoot and take you down, it was when. There was an inevitability to Khabib's successful implementation of his game plan, one that made the whole affair kind of like watching a knockout artist more than anything else. And for those of us who relished and appreciated every second this guy spent in top position, his work inside the cage just became more and more thrilling. I remember watching his ruthless destruction of Abel Trujillo back in the day, one of the first fights, if not the first fight I saw from him, and just being gobsmacked by how terrifying Nurmagomedov looked in there. On the feet, indeed, he was still raw, but there was a relentlessness to the way he pressured, to the way he repeatedly scored takedowns, eventually breaking the UFC's record for successful takedowns. By the end, Abel Trujillo was simply waving his arms in the air, complaining to the referee or his coaches about nothing more than the fact that he was completely out of his depth, that the competition that he was partaking in had lost all of its competitive value. I've never ever seen a fighter do that to someone in the way that Khabib did it to him. And from there, I just watched this guy get better, just get more efficient at what he does best. He wasn't a judo or jiu-jitsu guy who decided that he wanted to be the next Lyoto Machida. Khabib took his own blueprint, the essence of how he fights, and perfected it over the course of the next 7 years, refining it into what could well be called the perfect mixed martial arts approach. If the objective within the sport, at its most basic level, is to win and not to lose, to manage risk and give your opponent as little chance as possible, to dominate without chance for any pushback or retaliation, Khabib's style puts him in a league of his own in this regard, and that was a trademark of his game before he won the lightweight title. But I think during the stretch of form that made him a GOAT candidate, that trio of wins over some of his era's finest fighters, Justin Gaethje, Dustin Poirier, and Conor McGregor, it was his improved finishing ability, that final piece in the puzzle that really made us all kind of sit back and wonder exactly what we were watching. Over those 3 matchups in particular, he looked just about as good as any fighter we've ever seen, as unstoppable a force as the octagon has ever known. A force that was inevitable in there, making the list of pros that back up his GOAT argument uniquely intriguing. But what about his cons? As this series will show, every GOAT candidate will have their claim hindered in some way, and again, it just depends on what you value. First of all, the criticisms of the whole 29-0 thing in the first 16 fights of Khabib's career, I don't find them as relevant as I thought I would, and I don't think it's as relevant as you think it is. Because in reality, yes, of course, there were more than a few dodgy records to be found in those first 16 fights, including a number of losing records and debutants. But even if Khabib joined the UFC at 3-0 and retired as a 16-0 fighter instead of 29-0, would that actually make his greatness claim any less viable? Yeah, he took a lot of winnable fights that served only really to boost his record, but how much does it actually matter? Personally, I don't think so at all, because his unique claim at GOAT status isn't about the longevity of his peak. And I suppose that's the main criticism you can level at Khabib Nurmagomedov. He didn't do what John Jones or George St-Pierre did in capturing the belt, defeating all of the greats of that era in question, before then serving as champion while the next era rose up, all starting their own careers with the singular focus of dethroning you, the long-time champion. If your GOAT criteria needs a fighter to be challenged by the following generation, to live with that weight of being the champion for over a decade, with that mantle of being champion weighing on you heavier with each passing title defense, then Khabib's GOAT argument is not going to be for you. His victories over Poirier, McGregor, Gaethje, Dos Anjos, Barboza, and Iaquinta, 6 fights against really credible opposition, ones that showcase perhaps the single greatest example of a mixed martial arts fighter we've ever seen, in terms of his ability to win, to subdue, and to stack all of the odds in his favour. And he did it in a manner that was thrilling to watch, if you knew what you were watching. But we're never going to know just how Khabib's unique approach would work against the next wave, against the guys who grew into this game studying him, planning specifically how to crack his seemingly uncrackable code. He never got into the real danger zone when you're a champion. Defenses 8, 9, 10, 11. But I suppose there's a lot to be said for Khabib's decision to bow out of the sport, his reasons for doing so, and how he will leave such an unblemished legacy behind him. Khabib's exit was just about as unique as his approach. And when you take a look at the entirety of his career, the sheer lack of weak spots in there is absolutely shocking. And again, before the commenters start, you know what I mean by that. He might have failed the odd takedown, or taken a punch on his ironclad jaw, but when you have legions of his detractors pointing to the Michael Johnson fight, the McGregor 3rd round, or Poirier's guillotine as proof of his mortality, proof that he's human, you know that you're dealing with a fighter who barely slips up. That's the standard that Khabib has set through his dominance, and while sure, his claim at being the GOAT is a bit lopsided in some areas, there are other areas to it that no other fighters in MMA history can touch. The Eagle made you fight on his terms, left the sport on his own terms, and in our quest to find the GOAT, he's making us assess him in terms that are once again undoubtedly his own. Simply put, Khabib Nurmagomedov was one of a kind. But where does this former lightweight champion fall within your own GOAT conversation? And have you watched episode 1 of this series based around Anderson Silva? Do let us know in the comments section below. Let's really try to get a discussion going. Also, we've been running a poll in the community section of this channel to land on one extra episode for this series, one decided upon by you, the viewers. So head on over there once you're all caught up to have a say on episode 8. The series will be running over the course of the next 2 months, so if you enjoyed the second episode, be sure to show your support by leaving a comment, a like, and subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. Algorithm. Thanks for watching.